All right, tonight we're speaking with Simon Hill, the English football presenter who you'll hear calling Australia's highest level of football, the A-League, on the country's biggest sports network, Fox Sports. He's also a contributor for World Soccer magazine. An expat and heavy metal fan like myself, who now calls Australia home. He's previously worked for both the ITV and BBC television networks in England. How are you tonight, Simon?
I'm very good, Jesse. Nice to be with you. How are you?
Yeah, not too bad. As we're saying just before we record, it's pretty quiet time of the world, I suppose you could say. It's the evening at the moment, and we were asking you about what's keeping you busy, because you would sort of normally be prepping. You'd have games Friday, typically through Sunday, working. So what are you doing at the moment?
Not much, to be honest. A couple of these Zoom interviews, which have been welcome. I have done a couple of games using the new technology, using my laptop here that I'm speaking to you on. Did a game from Korea about a month ago, using some new technology from Grabio, where they pump the pictures live into your laptop and you literally call it from your front room. And I did the same thing for a game in the Northern Territory last Friday night. So I've not been totally lacking in work, but obviously, the norm would be this time of year. Well, we'd be finished with the A-League at this time of year, but we're still waiting for the A-League to resume. Hopefully, not too far away.
So, what is the technology? I mean, the way that you're talking about it, is it more than streaming, I guess, to your computer and how you're able to continue to work at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, it's live streaming straight to your laptop, basically. I mean, you get a code that you log into, and the pictures come up on your screen. You have a headset with a little microphone, and you call the game as normal, but just from the comfort of your own home. It's new technology. It's interesting. I think there are still, a couple of flaws to work out in terms of the audio, and we had an issue on Friday night where the pictures crashed because somebody dialed into the number that I was on. But I think these are all, teething problems, and I think in future we're going to see a lot more of this, because it doesn't just help, during a lockdown period, but also clearly it's better economically for broadcasters as well. Not to be sending commentators, flying around the country as we do most weeks. I hope we're not going to lose the in-stadium experience completely, because that's, part of the joy of being a commentator is actually being at the game. But I understand that, the current climate, maybe it's going to be something we do more frequently.
What's the difference between all the roles between a commentator, an analyst, a color commentator?
Good question. So a lead commentator, if you want to put it that way, or a play-by-play commentator, which is what I do, you literally call the action. You say the names and you describe what's happening. Now, in radio, where I used to work many years ago, that's probably a more labor-intensive job, because clearly people can't see the pictures. So you're having to describe not just who's on the ball, but where the ball is on the pitch. In television, you're sort of talking around the action a little bit more. But that's the role of the play-by-play commentator, to literally describe what the viewer is seeing and to call the names hopefully correctly. An analyst or a co-commentator is also the same terminology. In my case, that'll be a Robbie Slater or an Andy Harper or a Ned Zelic. They're there really to offer their technical expertise, because, of course, they've played the game at the very highest level, whereas I haven't. So they can perhaps see things on a football field that I don't, or the layman at home doesn't. I'm talking in terms of tactics, or maybe switches and systems that the coach has made. So that's what they're there for, essentially. And there are lots of other little roles around it, sort of sideline commentator, who is basically the eyes and ears of us down on the sideline. They might be listening to what the coach says, or they've seen something in the crowd, or something in the peripheral vision that the commentator might be too far away to get a full grip on. So, each person has his or her role, and if it all works smoothly, then hopefully you have a decent broadcast.
And it's a pretty coveted role to be able to get to call football. There's a lot of people I know that would like to do that. What's your story? How did you get involved in the game, and then how do you sort of end up? How do you end up at ITV, then BBC, and then decide that you're going to fly over to the bottom corner of the world where we're located now to take on a role?
Have you got a while?
I do. We've got time. I told you I've got a couple of drinks here. I've got time.
So where I started with football, obviously growing up in Manchester in Northern England, football is part of our DNA. The old joke is that when you're a baby, you get dipped in the River Irwell in Manchester or the Ship Canal, and you come out either red or blue, City or United. Now, I didn't have any choice really as to who I supported, because my dad was and still is at 85 a huge Manchester City fan. My granddad was a City fan all his life. And my great-granddad actually played for them in 1892, even before they were known as Manchester City. They were known as Ardwick FC. So you can see that there's a long family lineage of supporting that particular football club. When I was 5 or 6 years of age, my dad, as his dad had done with him, took me to see City. And I fell in love, not just with my club, but with the game. And from that moment on, really, I've been inseparable from it. I played, obviously, as many kids do, for my school and a couple of clubs when I was growing up. I pretty much knew I wasn't going to be a professional footballer at the age of 12. When a Manchester City scout came to watch a game that I was taking part in, he didn't even look at me. So I knew even at that age that dream was over.
Right.
And so it was about really, what's the next best thing, how to stay involved in football, because I loved it so much. So I think even from that age, I was, set on a career in the media with an eye really to being a football journalist. I wanted to write. I really had no interest in broadcasting. That sort of came about by accident, really. But yeah, I went to Portsmouth, did my degree, and then did a postgrad in written journalism, and started writing match reports on the Portsmouth youth team down for a paper called The News on the south coast of England. And then got my big break in 1991. I got a job as a sports reporter for a little radio station in South Wales called Red Dragon. So that's where it all started. Then I went to the BBC, and then I went to ITV. And then in 2001, I joined ITV in 2001 after nearly a decade with the BBC. And unfortunately, after a year, the ITV Sport channel, which was the network I worked for, went into administration. They didn't, unfortunately, have a very good business plan. So in 2002, I was sort of unemployed. I freelanced for about 6 months, and I was actually offered a job by Sky Sports in the UK. But at the same time, a friend of mine who I'd worked with at the BBC and who'd emigrated to Australia many years earlier got in touch with me and said, look, there's a job here as a football commentator. I think you should go for it. And of course, at the time I said, why would they want me? I'm some unknown from the other side of the earth. I'd only ever been to Australia for 5 days prior to that. But he went on about it so much that in the end I said, look, I'll send in a CV and a show reel, really to keep him quiet more than anything else. So I did that, and to my utter astonishment, they were back in touch within a couple of weeks and were very interested. And at the time, I wasn't married, I had no kids, still have no kids. So in 2003, I thought, well, what the heck? I'd always wanted to live overseas, knew nothing about Australia or about football here, but I just saw it as a great opportunity and a great life experience. I only expected to stay 2 or 3 years, really, but 17 years later, I'm still here.
So what year was that? Did you say that was 2003 at the time?
2003, January 2003, I moved across, and it was -5 in London, where I was living at the time.
Yeah.
And it was 45 in Sydney, so it was quite a culture shock, I can tell you.
And what was going on at the time? Because A-League was still about a year away from being started. Were you being brought in to do that, or were you being brought in to do, the national team football?
Well, to be honest, I was brought in to perform a sort of a multitude of roles, really. At the time, SBS, they had the national team rights. They didn't even have the rights when I arrived to the old National Soccer League, the forerunner of the A-League. But they did have the Champions League, they did have the Premier League, and one or two other bits and bobs. And of course, they had this 5-hour football show on a Sunday called the World Games. So my job was not only to commentate games as and when they needed it, but also to host on the World Game and to report and chase stories. So in the early years, my role was sort of multifunctional. I also presented on the generic sports show, Toyota World Sport, which, blimey, finished a long time ago now. So it was sort of like a utility role, really. And then in 2005, of course, the A-League started. And I was still at SBS then because the World Cup was coming up in 2006. So I did the World Cup and in Germany, which was obviously one of the highlights of my life. And then Fox, indicated that they were interested in bringing me across to be a full-time A-League commentator and host. So obviously that was what I did.
Interesting. Okay. There's a few probably really good stories that you can shed some light on, being able to share more of the history of the game than someone like me would know. I guess before we get on to City, which I'm sure you can bandy on about for a long time, Portsmouth is pretty interesting. I remember when I lived over there for about 2.5 years, and there was a very the two sort of football stories I remember while I was there was Portsmouth going bankrupt, and then also Wimbledon losing their club to was it MK Dons that they ended up selling off the rights to. I mean, as someone who went to school there, do you want to just take us through the Portsmouth story, because they're effectively a cooperative team now, if I'm not mistaken, are they?
Yeah, they are. Portsmouth is actually a club that's very close to my heart because, as I've outlined, I studied in Portsmouth, lived in the city for 4 years. I still go back regularly to the city. I have friends there still. And it's a wonderful old football club. The ground, Fratton Park, it's very rickety. It's almost fallen down in places. But it's got a real old style feel. And me coming from the north of England, where football is pretty much passionate in every single town, there was always a feeling in the north that the southerners weren't that fussed about it really. They were a little bit lukewarm in their passion. Well, I can tell you that Portsmouth is the closest thing to a northern town you'll get down south. I mean, they love their football club. And when I was a student there, I used to go and watch them quite regularly. I always became a bit of a fan of the club, not in the same way as Man City, because that'll always be my team, but I became quite close to them. And then obviously started my journalistic career by working with the club. It's very close to my heart. Unfortunately, in common with a lot of clubs a few years ago, even to the present day, really, they got into financial difficulty. They overstretched themselves. They got one of these, big money owners from overseas to finance the club, and he ran out of cash. And once that happened, they were in dire straits. They slipped down the leagues, and they were pretty close to going out of business altogether. So the fans, being very passionate about their club, decided, and this is not unique, a few clubs have done this, that they were going to buy the club themselves and run it themselves. So that's what they did. Now, I stand to be corrected on this, but I do think they do now have an investor. I think he's American. I'd need to check on all that. But they have got a benefactor now. But the club still has the supporters holding a significant share of the club. And I think that's, it's a good way of doing things, because a football club really it's for the supporters, it's for the town, the community. And, too many of these big, filthy rich owners, they come in with all sorts of promises, but once the money runs out, they leave the club in dire straits. And we've seen that story sort of repeat itself many times in the UK, unfortunately. But Portsmouth is still with us, which is great. The Wimbledon story is a little bit more complex in that they sold their old ground at Plough Lane, which was very run down and too small, on the premise of the fact that we're going to build a new one. The new club is actually going to build a new one now. But back in the day, they couldn't find a new site to build a new ground. They were playing at places like Charlton and Crystal Palace. Their fan base was dwindling because, of course, they were having to travel a long way to support their team. And in the end, they decided to sell to a businessman in Milton Keynes, a guy called Pete Winkleman. Now, they moved the club essentially lock, stock and barrel from southwest London to Milton Keynes. And a lot of people in England feel that that was the first sort of example of franchising, American-style franchising coming to English football, and they don't like it, and I'm with them. That was a very historic football club, Wimbledon FC. They now exist. They formed a Phoenix club, and remarkably, and this is again a tribute to the supporters, they've come all the way through all the non-leagues, and they're back in the Football League. In fact, I think they're a division higher than MK Dons are now.
Yeah, it was pretty much every year from their inception. They just popped up a league. They were constantly promoting themselves on the way up, were they not?
And that shows you the depth of commitment and passion that these supporters have for their football club. But what happened really was distasteful. And the English FA, I think they should have stepped in and said, no, you can't move a club 60 miles north. You can move within its locale, but really it has to be the same essence of the club. And what really irritated Wimbledon fans was when they moved to Milton Keynes, they took all the history with them.
That's what I was going to go on, yeah.
The memorabilia, I think, and again, I stand to be corrected, I think they've got those things back, or they're in the process of getting those things back for the new AFC Wimbledon, which is only right and proper.
I was over there at that time, and I remember I think the general manager of the team was Ivor, I think. I sat down and talked to him about this. And
Egil Olsen, was that?
No, I think no. He was a fan, and I think ended up working through the club on the rebuilding. And who was the big guy? The guy who was like the bodybuilder that they used as a forward there for a number.
John Fashanu.
No, I can Fabi or something. I can't remember, but I got to see them play when I was over there. So we had friends. They lived in Wimbledon, and then we went and stayed with them at their holiday home in the Isle of Wight, which is how we ended up passing through Portsmouth while living there at the time. How I got involved in understanding a little bit more about this history. Not to take away from Wimbledon, but a memory that I distinctly remember while I was over there is MK Dons beating United 4-0, and I think it was an FA Cup. I can't remember if it was an FA Cup or what would have been the Capital One Cup at the time. And just the fascination around that. You talk about Northern England and football fans in Manchester. Do you find that any sort of relation? Because really the only two places in the world where the sport of rugby league has a hold is either here in Australia or in the northern parts of England. Was that Is there any correlation, I guess, between those two parts of the world and I guess the similar love of sport that you found being over here?
In some ways, I mean, I sort of grew up with rugby league to an extent because I actually grew up in a town called Warrington. So, their senior sports club is a rugby league team. So it was always sort of there, but football is so dominant in the UK, even in rugby league areas, really, that leagues sort of exist to complement the sport of football. There's not really a rivalry between the sports. The one thing I found when I came here is just it wasn't so much the apathy towards football. I sort of expected that because I knew that Australia wasn't a traditional football country, if you want to put it that way. But what really surprised me was the antipathy towards football. It wasn't just that they weren't interested in it. They really didn't like it, those who didn't like it. And that still sort of shocks me to today. There's a little bit of identity politics all wrapped up in that, and a bit of cultural warfare because it's seen as not being an Australian game, which is ridiculous because, rugby league is not an Australian game. Cricket is not an Australian game, let's be honest. It's an English game. But they have no problem with that. So there's some synergy. I mean, there are working class areas of the north. I grew up in a working class area that's replicated in parts of Australia. I don't know. It's an odd one. I don't know why rugby league should be so prevalent here and in the north of England, but literally nowhere else.
There is a real divide, isn't there? There seems to be a line in England where it's Northern England where league has a foothold, and in the rest of the country it really doesn't at all, does it?
Well, it's not even a line sort of, cutting the country in half. It's actually a corridor. They call it the M62 corridor.
Okay.
Even in the northeast of England, up in Newcastle in the northwest, little bit, far northwest, but, they don't really play that much rugby league in Newcastle or Sunderland or Middlesbrough, those traditional football towns. So it's a very small sliver of the UK, of England specifically, that plays rugby league. And, it's sort of similar here, really. It's Brisbane, Sydney, Canberra, far north Queensland.
Well, I've got the term the Barassi line, I think, which denotes between AFL and league here, which is interesting. But
yeah, I think, obviously maybe we're talking culturally here, maybe Australians, were gravitating more towards rugby league because it was seen as more egalitarian than rugby union, for example, which was always seen as the gentleman's sport or the officer's sports, the sport of the
private schools.
Certainly the way in the UK as well. So it's an interesting one. I'm not quite sure, why rugby league is so big on the Eastern Seaboard. And look, I have no problem with, rugby league or Aussie rules for that matter. But they seem to have a problem with us. They don't like us very much.
I was a convert to the game. I wasn't always a football fan, as I mentioned, when we went to go live over there. I found expat Australians who wrote me into the arsenal, and then we were off once actually going to watch it. I got it over there. It's even though I'm Canadian, everyone talks about how much Canadians love hockey, and I do as well. But culturally, football is so much more intrinsic. And we traveled Europe, but we didn't live anywhere else. But the system, the promotion relegation, the way that England's got 250 clubs, which in theory at any point in time could compete in the Premier League if they work their way up. It's quite a fascinating structure as an outsider, and especially as a newfound fan during trade season when they're bringing in people from countries you barely knew existed, talking about their numbers. I'm blown away. The good scouts at teams must get paid a bucket load to be able to find people in remote islands that can have a 28 goal season. We'll talk about football more. Are there any other sports that you're partial to, or are you predominantly football in terms of being a fan?
I'm predominantly football. Growing up in my journalistic career, I worked on many sports. I covered Wimbledon a couple of times. I've done cricket finals at Lord's. I covered World Championship boxing. I even did the Le Mans 24-hour car race many years ago. I think, when you're going through the system, you have to obviously turn your hand to quite a few things. I did golf as well, all sorts of things. But, football has always been my number one sport. I did actually host the Ashes here when I worked at SBS in 2005, the cricket series, which was good fun. But no, for the last 10, 15 years particularly, it's been football, and I wouldn't have it any other way.
How do you try to navigate that? As you said, if there's sports that you don't know and they say, "Oh, hey, we've got cars that you're going to do. In a couple of weeks, you're going to comment on the cars." How do you prepare yourself for? I know in my case, really make yourself not sound like an idiot when being live.
Pretty much. It's all about research. And it's the same, even in my day job of football. I've worked in football for goodness knows how many years, but, I told you I did that game in Korea 4 or 5 weeks ago. Of course, I don't call John Book Motors or Sue on Blue Wings every day of my working life. So I had to research. So I did. And I think it's the same for any sports. If you can give yourself a decent grasp of what the tournament is, who the players are, what the context of what you're seeing is, then you can, as long as you're a good enough broadcaster, you can, I won't say get away with it, but you can pass muster. And obviously there are certain things that hold true for most sports. If you ask a decent question, then you'll get plaudits. If you ask a terrible one, it doesn't matter what sport you're working in. So it's the process is the same pretty much for every sport, but clearly the longer you work in one, which in my case is football, the more you tend to know about it.
All right. Talk to me a little bit about City. So again, as a relatively recent convert to the game, probably within the last decade, I certainly know Man United, but City seemed to be the team that took a backseat to them, that in the last few years with Arab money, they've turned themselves into a powerhouse club beginning probably about a decade ago. And I also know them because apparently Oasis supports them. Not that I'm a fan of the band or anything. However, they seem to, I guess, a similar story to Chelsea, who I'm told was always sort of a behind-the-scenes type of team that didn't have the same sort of success that you'd expect, that's just come out blazing in the last 10 to 15 years.
Well, this is a common misconception, of course, that City is a club that has no history. And I'm just going to move my head a little bit and show you this thing on the wall behind me. I didn't know you were going to ask me that question, but this picture is of Manchester City winning the FA Cup in 1934 and being presented with the old cup by King George. So that shows you, I mean, that's just one little example, but City is a club that has a very long history, formed in 1894 as Manchester City. And, we had periods in the distant past where we were successful, maybe not quite as successful as Manchester United or Liverpool or Arsenal, but City have always been one of the big clubs in England. It's true also that in the 80s and particularly 90s, we dropped a long way. As recently as 1999, we were, you mentioned promotion relegation, we were down in the third tier.
Right.
I went most weeks that particular season. I was driving up from London to see them, games against Chesterfield and York City and Wrexham, and they were pretty dark days. So it does rile me a little bit when people say, "Oh, this new club that's all of a sudden found success." Well, we've rediscovered success. Back in the late 60s, early 70s.
I worded my question poorly because I know that they've been around for a century, but I think you understand what I mean, that they have not had Manchester United as a North American is sort of the comparison to what you'd expect from like the Chicago Bulls during their time with Jordan and Beckham. And I just mean, for most people, they're unaware that there was a second team also around at that time.
Well, that's unfortunate because, as I say, look, I understand that United has more of a global feel, maybe a little bit less so these days because City has have come up fast over the last 10, 15 years. United were always this global entity, and that was largely built, not exclusively, but largely built on the back of a tragedy, which was the Munich air disaster in 1958, where they lost a whole heap of players that were really at the top of their game at the time. So there was a wave of global sympathy for the club, and people sort of latched onto them a bit. 10 years later, they won the European Cup, so that sort of cemented their place again globally as a big club. And they were also, to be fair to them, not only successful in terms of winning Premier Leagues and FA Cups, etc., under Sir Alex Ferguson, and European Cups as well, but they were also one of the first clubs to explore global branding. They introduced things like the Red Cafe in Singapore and really connected with their overseas fan base because they were a club that could do that. Now, City at the time I remember there was a phrase, City were the club that stayed at home. Within the boundaries of Greater Manchester, where I'm from, there are probably similar numbers of City and United fans. In fact, many City fans believe there are more City fans in Manchester than United. I don't know if that's true or not, but it's certainly true that City, while it has a big fan base of its own, was pretty much the club that was local to Manchester. So the two clubs sort of, went their separate ways around the 50s. Prior to that, actually City historically were the more successful club, and certainly the bigger club. I don't know if you know this, but post-war as well, Old Trafford was actually bombed by the Luftwaffe, right. And United came and played at Main Road. They shared City's ground. And up until I think the 50s and 60s, a lot of people in Manchester, my grandfather included, would go and watch City one week and United the next. There wasn't really the same enmity between the two clubs. That sort of came a bit later in the 60s when the modern era arrived. So it's a fascinating history. Obviously, I know it very deeply because I'm from that part of the world. But yeah, I mean, it's, of course, the success that City are having at the moment is wonderful for us, and I'm not stupid enough not to believe that if it weren't for the money, it wouldn't have happened. There is also part of me that actually misses the old City. There was a very northern British humour, a gallows humour in being perpetually crap, and going to these places and having a laugh with other City fans because we were always so bad, and we had this great contrast down the road of Manchester United, the great behemoth that were winning trophies. I'll give you one little example. Excuse me. Back in 1999, when we were in the third tier, City were playing in the Auto Windscreen Shield, which is a competition for third and fourth division clubs.
Right.
Since been renamed. And on the same night, United played, I think, Inter Milan in the Champions League. There were 75,000 at Old Trafford, and across town, I was one of the 4,000 that went to watch us against Mansfield, and we lost. And that was, but I remember thinking, I don't care what the contrast is. I'm going to bloody well be there tonight because my club needs me.
Yeah.
And that's the sort of ingrained, tribalism that was injected into me from the time I could walk.
When you're talking about this, I actually have a photo with the Premiership trophy, because when I was living over there, I think, did City win in 2013? I think they were is that the year?
2012 and 2014.
So it would have been 2012. So I went to the Soccerex convention that they hold in I think it was being held in Manchester that year. And they got all there, and they were the trophy holders for it. There's quite a few things to talk about in there from a time period that I'm unfamiliar with. One of which, well, I guess when we talk about modern football now, and I guess we're going to begin to see this only because I've got you on the line. I'm really interested in talking to you about historically about English football and all sort of the questions that I have, and kind of driving that into A-League football. You mentioned that the role of a football team should be to serve the community. What's the relevance of that these days when you hear about a player who's on a contract of £150,000 a week, and the fact that, as I said, even when I was living over there, I had to buy an Arsenal Red membership, which was the basic level membership for the opportunity to get tickets to games. So you had to buy in at a 60,000 seat stadium for the option to get tickets to a game.
Yeah, it's a very good question. And it's one of the reasons why I say I do miss the old City. And by that, I also mean I miss the old football, where the clubs were much more of an intrinsic part of their community. Having said that, and I'll use the City as an example, and yes, we've been bought out by the trillionaires from the UAE, and City today is unrecognizable from the club that I grew up supporting. But in some ways, they do still connect to the community, and these are things that don't necessarily make for sexy headlines. Yaya Toure getting £200,000 a week on his salary is a sexy headline, but the owners investing in a local library in Manchester, which they have done on the edge of the Etihad complex, that's not a sexy headline. Building entertainment for fans pre-game on the apron of the stadium, having former players, themed bars, places for kids to play Xbox, they're not particularly sexy headlines, but City do that as well. Having local school children come in and have education lessons in the Etihad complex, that's not a sexy headline, but City do that too. So there's a lot of things that get swallowed up because football is so all-encompassing, and people almost want to be envious, I think, of the wages footballers earn. But let's be honest, they only earn that money because gullible fools like us are willing to pay for lots of membership cards and shirts and all the rest of it. We have a choice in this. We can say, I'm not doing it. I can't afford it, or I don't agree with it, and I'm not doing it. Now, to be fair, some people do. But they get paid relatively to what the market is willing to pay. I'm not saying that's right, but it's reality. Sure. What worries me more about English football and football worldwide is that the big clubs, and I include City in this incidentally, are getting so big that the smaller clubs down the pyramids, and we've seen this already with the demise of Bury, a very historical club who won the FA Cup twice at the turn of the last century. They went bust last year, and a lot of other clubs, particularly with COVID-19, are essentially living hand to mouth. I think the bigger clubs, and again I include City, I think they could help those clubs, because without a pyramid, you're left with the greatest respect, Jesse, a North American system of closed leagues. And I don't particularly like, I know we have that in Australia as well, but that's for a slightly different reason. And we are looking to change that. But closed leagues, I don't think football fans want. I don't think they want a European Super League. I don't think they want a Premier League that is so utterly divorced from the rest of the pyramids that it bears no relation to each other. Football is an ecosystem, and it should be interconnected. And the big clubs, yes, they're massively important, and they generate the wealth, but they also still, dip into the lower reaches for players. And if those smaller clubs get promoted, they have to play those two. You still need opposition. So I think we have to be very careful where we're going with all this at the moment.
I want to talk about that further, but I just wanted to, while you were you're bringing up all these memories I had when I was living over there, and you talk about craziest headlines that you heard, and I would have forgotten it otherwise, but I remember the story of Mario Balotelli driving down the streets throwing cash out the top of his car into the streets. A City guy, if I'm not mistaken, for a few years there before he went off to Italy. It's interesting that you mentioned closed system, though. I think Australia does present something different because we're the size of the US with 1/11th the population. So I think it's pretty hard to have promotion relegation in some of these towns that have 15,000 people. But you talk about a closed system. Again, I think hockey, like the NHL, could be NBA or basketball. But at the end of the day, generally speaking, soccer players, the top tier of those sports, are still making more money than closed circuit leagues.
Yes, they are. And that's, certainly in England, that's due in part to the fact that the Premier League has such a global presence. Now, if you want to go into politics and culture, you could say that one of the reasons for that is that back in the day, England or Britain, conquered half the world and turned it pink. I'm not saying that was the right thing to do, by the way, but it's a fact. So there's a lot of English-speaking peoples around the world, and English, of course, due to America, is the international language. So, the Premier League was very transportable to most countries across the world. And I think it was the advent of the Premier League that sort of recognized that and thought, you know what, we're going to cash in on that. And they have done. And they've made it the most commercially successful football league, maybe even sporting competition on the planet. Now, they're to be commended for doing that. In the process, has that divorced them from reality in terms of the money that's slopping around the game? Yeah, probably. But unfortunately, that's the way of things with big business, isn't it? Which is what football is. I mean, you can say the same for Amazon or Yahoo, or once they go global, they lift into a different stratosphere, and it's sometimes a little bit hard to relate to them. But yeah, that's the capitalist world we live in, I guess.
It is fascinating because, as I said before, I was a fan. I mean, it's truly the world game. So we've flown over to Singapore to go watch Arsenal play. The preseason tours that are pretty much just cash cows for them for the opportunity to go have beer on a holiday. It's a very fascinating thing to watch now that I'm kind of part of it. Before we go into A-League type stuff, you would have been around. What do you remember about the era of football hooliganism? I'm just looking over at my bookshelf, and I can see these John King books, who was the author of all these sort of I guess I almost want to call them the equivalent of Anthony Burgess' Clockwork Orange of football literature at the time. It's still a pretty infamous time, and a lot of people, either outsiders who aren't European, either associate, again, football with sort of this game of diving, or this really violent period in the 80s.
Yeah, well, look, I lived through that. That was the decade when I was a teenager, and started going to games on my own, on those terraces, traveling on the football specials, going on the supporters club coaches. Did hooliganism exist? Yeah, absolutely. And there were, a couple of incidents, but by and large, they were isolated. And I'm not trying to defend it, by the way, but they were groups of thugs looking for other groups of thugs to go and have a rumble with. And football was the vehicle they chose. Some of it was about defending territory and, that macho stuff of my club against yours. But I've been to goodness knows how many football games in my life, thousands and thousands. And I can honestly say I've only ever felt threatened maybe once or twice. Once was coming back from a game at Liverpool in the mid-80s, where we inevitably lost. And I saw a fellow City supporter get slashed with a knife on the train. So that wasn't inside the football stadium, but obviously it was football related. The other time was at Stoke, again, 1989, I think it was. And it was a game when City took 12,000 supporters to the old Victoria ground, and almost sort of took over the local stadium. And obviously, the locals didn't like that. And they came out and had a bit of a pop, and I think I got kicked once. But really, it was there, but it was only there if you wanted to be involved in it. And I never did. I mean, I was approached a couple of times. Each club had their own little firm. It's all beer and bravado stuff, really. The Cities was called the Cool Cats or the Young Governors. And, once or twice they'd shove a card in my hand and say, come and join the Young Governors. I'd say, no, thanks. I'm not interested. Because I was never there for that. I was there for football. And yeah, it got a bit edgy at times. And, you'd do a bit of posturing. But I always felt that most of the other blokes were like me. They were there for the football. They were there for the crack. They'd had a couple of beers. They might get a bit mouthy. And it was all part of the game, really. But get involved in fist fights and flick knives and, pitch battles? No thanks. I know it happened. To me, the bigger danger in the 80s was, and tragically, obviously, we saw this with Hillsborough, was that the stadiums were horribly dilapidated. I stood on that Leppings Lane terrace a couple of times in Sheffield prior to that Hillsborough disaster. I was also on the Kippax May 1985 when City got promoted against Charlton. There were 48,000 there, and I remember being very uncomfortable on the terrace. I was only 17, 18, and I was squashed. But it was more that I couldn't get my arms up, and it wasn't that I couldn't breathe. But I remember, getting out at the end and thinking, "Oh, that was a bit uncomfortable."
Is it like the equivalent of being in a mosh pit at a heavy metal show? Is that sort of the sort of squish that you sort of feel in that sort of environment?
No, probably it was worse than that on that day, because when the goals went in and we scored 4 that day, the crowd surges. So you get carried away. You get carried along with it. You have no choice. You can't say, "Well." You just go, boom, you're gone. And you normally got stopped by the crush barriers with 20 people behind you, which obviously winded you. So they were dangerous places to a large degree, but it was of its time. And, I for one, I miss the atmosphere that the terraces provided, for all that they were run down and decrepit and in places dangerous. Most of the time you were perfectly safe, and it created a great atmosphere. And I think we've lost a bit of that, to be honest.
Was it just a couple of years? Was it a 5-year period? Was it a decade of that sort of the violence surrounding it? Because it seemed that by the early 90s they had stomped it out. But as someone who would have been too young around that time, I'm just trying to put some time frames around when this would have been going on.
Yeah, look, it probably started in early 70s.
Okay.
That's when it really started to kick off. I don't quite know why. Maybe it was in the UK, it was a time of political austerity and political uncertainty in the early 70s. I think we had, the 3-day week, power cuts, strikes, the winter of discontent, 1978. This all has to be seen in context of the political situation, I think, of the day. The rise of punk rock, with young kids wanting to rebel against the system as they normally do, or at least they used to. I don't know whether they still do. So I think all of that sort of contributed, and that carried on and got probably more hardcore in the 80s when you got fringe sort of criminal gangs becoming involved, because they saw it, A, as a chance to have a go at other criminals, or B, more likely, the police. So, there was around the early 80s in the UK, and I remember this very vividly because obviously I was there. You had the threat of nuclear war, you had the rise of AIDS, you also had Thatcher's Britain, which created a very unequal society, and there was a lot of anger among young people growing up. I was one of them. I grew up in the north of England where jobs were at a premium, and we didn't know if we had a future, to be honest. So maybe this all had a part to play in the hooligan culture. But I stress that I still think it was a very fringe activity. Out of all the thousands of games I went to in the 80s, I maybe felt unsafe maybe once, twice. Most weeks, you were fine.
I remember we did a trip over to Serbia at the time, and we got sort of introduced to that rivalry between Red Star and I can't remember who the other team is, and I'm Partizan. Yeah, I've still got one of their cups, the black and white mugs there, and they're talking to us about during the Yugoslavian Civil War. Apparently, that was sort of a breeding ground for it was to take football hooliganism. And apparently, one of the main guys, I can't remember from either one of the clubs, effectively ended up running the militia for them during the.
I think that was Arkan, wasn't it?
Arkan. Okay, so this is quite a familiar story then to Europeans at the time. Okay. Yeah. So what actually happened with Hillsborough then? So again, because growing up, I didn't hear anything about this until it sort of got back in the news that they were finally, I think what were the equivalent of a royal commissioner. They're finally going to reopen this case, 20 years after the fact. And a couple of years ago, something was handed down. But again, as outsiders looking in, it seemed that standing room only, fenced off terraces where people got squished. And then it became an argument of, were the crowds too violent versus was it heavy-handed policemen who locked them in there to die, I guess, as an outsider looking in?
Well, unfortunately, as the case has proven, it was the latter. For many years, the popular narrative was that it was hooliganism that had caused Hillsborough. And I know up until very recently, that still prevailed even here in Australia. What happened on the day was, too many people were trying to get into the stadium, and the police opened the gates negligently, but they only opened once or two specific gates, which led these supporters down into this particular part of the ground known as a pen, which was already full to capacity. So, of course, when it's like filling up a milk jug, isn't it? You fill it to capacity, and then you try and put a bit more in, and there's nowhere for the milk to go. So that's where, unfortunately, people started getting crushed, not only against the crush barriers, but also in their attempts to get out, of course. They couldn't, because at the time, fans were fenced in because they were frightened of pitch invasions and hooliganism. So it was sort of the double whammy, really. Now, I'm not saying that the police deliberately tried to kill supporters. Of course they didn't. But they were negligent in what they did, and basically led people unwittingly to their deaths by opening those two pens in order to relieve a crush outside. Now, whether that was a tale of miscommunication or I think that's probably been proven since. I think the chief commander of the day, I think it was Richard Duckenfield, his name is, who's since been prosecuted, was new to that job and hadn't necessarily gone through the safety procedures correctly, which of course, as the arbiter of law and order on the day, he should have done. There was also question marks against the safety certificate of Hillsborough as a ground. Certainly the Leppings Lane terrace was, as I've mentioned already, in common with many other terraces, very old, very decrepit, probably not been updated since the 1930s. A lot of English grounds were like that up until the 90s. And all of those factors contributed to, tragically, 96 football fans losing their lives that day. And what compounded that loss of life was the narrative that ran in the media for the best part of the next 20, 30 years, which said that they were to blame. And that not only were they to blame, but they stole from their fellow fans as they died, and urinated on them, and terrible, really. And unfortunately, that was the story that was pretty much agreed upon to cover up the police's role in it. And it's only now that the truth has come to light, and finally those families have got some semblance of justice. If you want a better take on this, by the way, you should read a book called And the Sun Shines Now by an author called Adrian Tempany, who was in the crowd at Hillsborough and very nearly died. He was pulled to safety at the last minute. And his book is all about those moments, but also what happened afterwards and their fight for justice. It's a very moving, very powerful book.
Do you think so many years later, okay, I'll rephrase this question, during the time when the fans themselves were blamed, was that believed by the general public at the time? It's probably easier. Yeah. Do you think that perception has changed now with the findings?
Yeah. It's changed now, but A, it's taken 30 years, and B, it's taken a court case for the truth to come out. Excuse me, I've got a frog in my throat. Right. When really the truth should have been got at an awful lot quicker to give those families, peace of mind. In effect, they've been punished twice for one tragedy. They lost a family member, and they were also vilified, posthumously for causing it. So it's been a long battle for justice, and I'm not sure it's been, it's come to a conclusion totally satisfactorily for all parties concerned. But certainly I think that now that the perception has changed and people realise that actually the police, I don't want to use the word were to blame, but they were responsible because they didn't do their job properly on the day.
Fair enough. We'll bring it over to Australian football, which I'm a little bit more comfortable with now that I get to hear you up to three days a week during the summer months. One of the things that the A-League has done, which bothers me quite a bit, is over the last few years they have one of the things that makes football great to go to is the chanting, is the boisterous crowds. And the A-League has done an incredible job of stamping out the fun in football effectively by killing off the groups that made it worth going to watch, which to a lot of the people that I've brought, who, as you said, with especially here in Australia, with people that really could, you can offer them free football tickets and they won't even want to go. You get them there and they see this going on. That enough, and in some cases, depending upon who's playing, I might mention the Mariners versus whoever in this case, is more entertaining than the actual game itself that's happening on the field. And it seems that the A-League has done its best to rid the most entertaining aspect of the game. I mean, you would have seen it. You were around at the time. What was happening then? Because a lot of this active support hasn't come back, even though they have tried to shirk away from that and try to encourage that again.
Well, first of all, can I say you're absolutely right. You couldn't be more right. unfortunately, what happened, and this goes back to 2015, and an article written by the late Rebecca Wilson in the Sunday Telegraph in
Is this
Sydney.
where she called football fans more violent than league and thuggish? I remember this controversy because it made national news the next day, I think, from it.
Yep.
It's headline news.
Well, she ran a front page article, or the Telegraph ran a front page article with photos of 198 football supporters saying they were all hooligans and saying that football was a game in disgrace that couldn't control its lunatic fringe, and the game was in all sorts of trouble. And I mean, look, it was a ridiculous story. Of course, we have people on banned lists, and I'm not saying some of those on the front page didn't deserve to be there, but a lot of those photos of people that appeared were of people who were underage, people who've been found guilty of no more than either being drunk and disorderly or invasion of a pitch after scoring a goal. I'm not saying that that's the right thing to do, but it's not exactly as though you're going stabbing somebody. And the picture was painted of a game that was chaotic, and it just was not true. It was not true. A lot of us were very angry about it, including me. And on the Tuesday of that following week, the FFA had to stand up and have a press conference, essentially, to address this particular issue. Unfortunately, David Gallop, the CEO, or the then CEO of the FFA, and look, I like David. I know him reasonably well professionally. I've always got on fine with him. But unfortunately, his response that day was woefully inadequate. We expected him to stand up and essentially say, look, we have the best fans in the country. We might have one or two idiots and we'll root them out, but our fans provide the great atmosphere. We'll defend them to the hilt. That was what he should have said as the CEO of the game. And instead, he defended the article.
I think the other thing that's quite surprising from him, for people that don't know him, is he used to be the CEO of Rugby League, which has its own, not just aggressive fans, but the behavior of the players in many cases. It's outside of the rules of the game, the next law of the game is how much you're going to fine them for out of play activity that goes beyond the means. So I agree with you. I was very blown away by it, but I remember that, and it just seemed to instantly, and especially for people that don't follow the game, even though I'm not a fan of the club like the Victory, they had multiple active support groups happening. That those active support groups in and of themselves was pretty much enough to carry over a membership of a club year to year.
Well, I was just going to finish off by saying that what happened on the back of that was the response from the fans to Gallup's press conference was, "That's it, we're out." Now, to be fair to him, 2 days later, they did a second press conference because the response to the first was so bad. And he did come out and say all the right things. Too late. They clamped down hard on the active supporter groups. One or two needed to be weeded out because there were some idiots in there. But they used a sledgehammer to crack a nut in order to try and appease the mainstream. And this is the mistake that the game has made over and over and over again. In its bid to try and be part of the mainstream scene, it has appeased what it thinks the mainstream wants. What we need to do as a game is sell our own sport on its own merits. And a big part of that is the atmosphere that fans provide. I maintain in the first couple of years of the Wanderers, 2,000 people turned up every week to watch the RBB because they were create such a brilliant atmosphere. That's what football is about. And we were building that, and we self-destructed. We killed it ourselves. And so far, we haven't been able to get it back, it makes me very, very angry, to be honest, that we did that. But that was our leaders at the time. And the reason they did it is because they weren't football fans. They didn't really understand football culture. Now, we do have a CEO today in James Johnson, who's an ex-player himself. He understands the game perfectly well. He's worked for FIFA, AFC, the PFA. He gets it. Is it too late to get those fans back? I hope not. But he's got a tough job on his hands, but we've got to try.
There's going to be a lot of people listening to this that if they've chosen to listen so far about soccer or football or however you deem it, about what Australian football is like. That'll be interesting to me because you will know more about the game having grown up with it. Again, one of the things that's very strange to me, as I said, as a convert myself, as someone who didn't grow up, only got engulfed in it because I was there. And when I came back, I said, I want to have a team support, and got involved in it. I'm blown away by the fact that so many people will have a European team, but this seems to be the one sport where they will not get on board with a local side in the comp. Frankly, I don't understand it at all of why you could say I'm happy to wake up at 2 a.m. and watch City play on a Sunday night, but I won't go down to the local sports ground to go support my team for $20 on a Friday. First of all, I don't understand that. But in terms of actually, let's talk about that for a second, because you know exactly what I'm talking about. What is the issue?
Yeah. Well, the issue, as with a lot of issues in football in Australia, is multi-layered. Some of it is history. Obviously, this is a country of immigrants. I'm English, you're Canadian. Everybody in this country is from somewhere. So we tend to bring our own culture with us to a large degree, particularly when it comes to football, because football is, the game in most other countries in the world. So if you come from England, as I did, I bring Manchester City with me. Just because I'm here doesn't make me stop supporting Manchester City. But a lot of people, do also have a local team, but a lot can't because they're too tied to that former club. Or if you're from Greece, AEK Athens or Panathinaikos or Olympiakos, or if you're from Serbia, Partizan or Red Star, or if you're German, Bayern Munich or Borussia Dortmund, whatever it is. So that's part of the problem. The second issue is an issue of snobbery, which says this league's not good enough. I can watch the Premier League. Why would I need to watch the A-League? The standard's no good. But my counter argument to that is, well, okay, if it's only the Premier League and maybe one or two others, La Liga, the Bundesliga, that are worth watching, why do we have a global game? Why do we have professional leagues in over 200 countries? What about all those people? Should they just not bother with their team as well? The difference is tribalism. Now, part of why we don't have it here to the same degree is, as I've mentioned, everybody here is from somewhere else, and they keep that identity. The second big reason is that our A-League clubs are pretty new. They only have 15 years of history, as opposed to those in Europe that have well over 100. So, the history of the sport in this country is very fractured. The National Soccer League, worked well for a while, produced some great players, but ultimately died because people were, supporting those because they were tribal about those clubs. But over the generations, if you were a supporter of a Greek club of Greek heritage,
it was too ethnically organized, effectively.
Yeah, it was too ethnically organized, and as the generations went on, that passion for the homeland sort of diluted a little bit, at least with regards to the local club. So there's a whole host of reasons. There's also, some cultural resistance towards football in general in Australia. I'm saying some. There's a lot of cultural resistance towards football in Australia. And the other codes, AFL and Rugby League in particular, who aren't international sports, know that if they cede ground to soccer here, then they're stuffed, and they're not going to give up that territory lightly. So they have a very compliant media, which works for them. They have people who, push buttons for government and big corporate industries in Australia, so they swallow up most of the dollars. So we can't promote our games. We have very little cash in football in Australia. So there's a whole heap of things that are trained up against the success of the A-League here in Australia. And really, just in closing on this particular point, it's a miracle that the A-League not only exists, but does so well in many ways. The fact that we went from ground zero in 2005 to a league, even today, and we say, the crowds are poor today, but it averages 10,000. A lot of leagues around the world would kill for that average crowd.
Is that right?
We have a live TV deal. We have a $57 million a year investment from Fox. Big sponsors. We have a national team that's played at the World Cup the last 4 occasions. Matilda's doing really well. As a game in general, we're not quite as bad as we think we are. But again, it's always put into that prism of what's it like in comparison to the Premier League or the Bundesliga or the Rugby League or the AFL? Well, of course we're not at that level, but the bigger picture ain't too bad.
I don't disagree with you. I've been a member of my club for a number of years, and I enjoy because again, I wasn't born or raised here. So when I came back from the UK, to me, summer means football now. I think that's a great way to spend the day. But in the few chances that they have, so I remember for what I do for business, I got the chance to speak with Scott Barlow, who is the chairman for Sydney FC, and this would have been going back about 5 years ago. And I remember even back then he was telling me how close they are to a free-to-air deal. That has never materialized, and the few times that they have seemed to put it on free-to-air television, well, we've got ABC. It bounced between SBS and then ABC. We know that, but it suggested that they were getting a deal because I remember they tried a couple of trial Saturday night games on 9, I think, as Sydney derbies that happened, but never seemed to get off.
Channel 10 had the rights for 2 years as a subsidiary broadcaster of Fox Sports. But unfortunately, they put it on their secondary channel and didn't really promote it. So it didn't particularly rate. SBS and ABC have both had, stints at showing free-to-air games. But you're right that, one of the big commercial players has not so far come in and invested in football. And that in part is due to the fact that they invest an awful lot more in Aussie rules, cricket, rugby league. So football is well down the pecking order. But I think, just to preempt your next question, I think we're moving into an era where free-to-air television and pay television even is changing. We're all moving towards this digital future, which in many ways is going to level up the landscape a lot because you are no longer restricted to your own local market, but you can go global. You can literally broadcast your games anywhere in the world. I think that's going to benefit us as a sport because we're a global game. The others aren't. Nobody's going to get up in the middle of the night in, even Indonesia to watch a game of AFL. Sorry, it's not going to happen. But they might watch the A-League, and a lot of countries do even now. We have deals with the US, Canada, I think, as well, parts of Africa, Europe, the UK show it on BT Sport. It doesn't have a massive audience, but it has a niche audience. People watch it because it's football. And football being the global game, I think will always ultimately win.
And people gamble.
Yeah, because that's it.
What do you think of the league itself? So again, as I said, when I talk to people, a lot of people that I know that have European teams that won't follow it here. And there's a lot of disparaging comments about it. Realistically, again, because I can't really gauge the quality. A lot of people told me it sits somewhere between Championship and League One. Is that accurate to you?
To be honest, I don't care. It doesn't matter to me. Would some of the A-League clubs survive in the Championship? Yeah, I think so. Would some of them struggle? Undoubtedly. It's the same as any other league. There are good games, there are bad games, there are good players, there are bad players. It's just that we constantly look at the A-League through this prism of, but what's it like in comparison to this? Who cares? It's football. It's our league. It's our local competition. It's the best we have in this country. Why don't we support it on that basis alone? I told you early on in this chat, 1999, I used to go and watch Man City in the 3rd division in England. Let me tell you, that year, we were bloody awful. We were terrible. We were a 3rd division team that lumped the ball up in the air and tried to get second ball, for Sean Gota. They were awful to watch. Didn't matter. It was my club. So I was there week in, week out anyway. That's what we have to build here. It's not about, and we've had this before, if they play better football, I'll come and watch. Well, let me tell you, in 2010-11, under Ange Postecoglou, Brisbane Roar played football that wouldn't have been out of place in Europe. They were sensational. Now their crowds are back down below 10,000. So what did that achieve? People didn't stick with them just because they played good football. they didn't stick with them because they didn't have a tribal affiliation to that football club.
Yeah.
And that's what we have to build. And people say, oh, get marquees, and you need big names. What happens when they leave? You should not fall in love with the player. You fall in love with the badge on the front of his shirt. That's the connection that we have to make in this country. And too often we either ignore it or we just don't recognise it.
The same argument was said for Sydney FC in their recent last 4 years of utter dominance. I think by year 2 they realized that the crowds of 1850 wouldn't get any higher than that, no matter what time of day they were playing on a Saturday or anything, and just trying to adjust to that. Where do you think Australian football goes from here? And again, I'm talking about the dominance of Sydney FC right now, because they seem to be the ones pushing, because they have the money again, that we might begin to see a little bit more of what we see in England with, I don't know the rules ins and out, but I think there's a salary cap, except for you get one domestic marquee and now 2 international marquees.
Yeah.
And even that seems to blow out. As I mentioned, I'm up in Newcastle now. Central Coast is just an hour below me. I think Sydney FC only started turning over a profit recently, but they've got the sort of owners that can afford to put in that for the purpose of no more than fun. Where do you think that begins to leave the league, when realistically, as I said, we're the size of the US with 26 million people, with a lot of the markets that we're playing in sub 1 million people?
Well, look, I don't think we've explored our big clubs well enough, to be honest. We're obsessed in this country with equality, which is why we have these silly salary caps, which, I'm sorry, don't work in football, because you're competing in a global game. You're competing in a global market for players. It works in Aussie rules and rugby league because they're not played anywhere else. The best talent in the world is always going to be here. They might move clubs, but they'll always be in Australia. Now, we don't have that. If we don't pay for quality, players move on. Now, we're never going to be the Premier League. We can't offer Yaya Toure £200,000 a week. Nobody's expecting that. But at the moment, we lose even mid-tier players to Asia for the sake of $20,000, $30,000 because we can't squeeze them into the cap. Does that help the quality of the league? I don't think so. We're so obsessed with equality. Everybody's got to have an equal chance to win it. Well, that's not the way the world is. That's not the way football is. You have big clubs, you have small clubs. Now, if you got rid of the salary cap and said you can spend what you want, what you can afford, yes, Sydney FC, Melbourne City, Western Sydney Wanderers, Melbourne Victory would win more titles than most. That's happening now anyway. So what's the difference? The Central Coast Mariners have finished bottom 3 out of the last 4 seasons and are on track to do so again this year because they can't afford even to spend the full salary cap. So how is that helping with equality? It's not. We have to have more of an open system, I think, in terms of the finances. I do also think we desperately need a second division for player pathways as much as anything else, and coaches. But also to stimulate interest at the bottom of the A-League. You can have a game between 9th and 10th, even with 4 rounds to go, and it means nothing because next year they'll go around the same again. It's like getting a certificate in the egg and spoon race for just taking part. We've got to have punishment for failure and reward for success.
Isn't that what the NPL? Well, we don't have that yet, but isn't the NPL supposed to be that? Isn't the NPL supposed to act in that way?
Well, no, because there's no promotion and no relegation to or from it. So, yes, it's supposed to develop players, which it does. But another issue is, and again, this goes back to the finances, the amount of compensation that is offered to an NPL club for developing a good player, which is taken by an A-League club. The maximum they can get is $3,000.
Right.
Where's their stimulant to go and develop those players? It's not there because there's no reward in it for them. So we have a system in this country that is very much based around what the other codes do. I understand why that's the case, but we're surely now at a point of our development where we've got to say, that's all well and good. If you want to do that, you carry on doing that. But we're football. Our sport is different because it's a global game, and therefore we have to act differently.
Are there moments or games that you recommend to people if people go, I check this out? Or are there particular games that you remember and say, this is what I think you should watch?
Talking about a non-A-League fan, if I was trying to attract them to a game? There's many. I would certainly tell them to go and watch a Sydney derby. Certainly one from a few years ago, which is still on YouTube, where I think Karen Bullitt scored twice, and Sydney still won 4-3, packed stadium. That would certainly be one game. The grand final of 2011, Brisbane Central Coast Mariners, incredible drama. Brisbane came from 2-0 down with, I think, 5 minutes to go.
It was extra time, I think, when they scored both.
Ultimately won.
Yeah.
And another one involving the Wanderers and Brisbane Roar in the finals a few years ago, in which Brisbane were 3-0 up at half-time and ended up losing 5-4 after extra time, I think. So there's loads of great games in the A-League. There's a lot of ordinary games as well. That's just sports, whatever the code. But we've had some incredible moments. In fact, just the other day I did one of these Zoom things with a few other people. We had to try and narrow it down, 32 of the best moments in the A-League's history, and we found it really difficult because there were a lot.
Right. Okay. More from a business perspective, and again, I'm sitting on the sidelines, so I haven't followed it recently, but I remember going back about a year ago. There was there's a power struggle at the moment. So Frank Lowy effectively bankrolled the A-League going back about 15 years ago, and he stepped down. No,
he was the chairman. He certainly didn't bankroll it.
Okay, sorry. Rather help put it all together. Help put a lot of the moving pieces together. Is that a better way of wording it?
Yes.
Okay. And once he stepped down, his son effectively sort of moved into that role, and there seems to be a very big issue now between again, the league controlling the league or allowing teams a level of autonomy to operate. That's what I know about it. Am I correct in saying this, and can you shed some light on this for us?
Yeah, look, broadly, it's a very complex topic, this one. So essentially when Frank Lowy stood down in 2015, and his 10 years by and large were very successful as chairman, maybe with the exception of the World Cup bid, but that's another story completely. When he stepped down in 2015, as per constitution, the governing body looked for a successor, and lo and behold, they found him across the dinner table, and it was Frank's son, Stephen. Now, again, I met Stephen many times, really like him, but he wasn't the right choice for the game at the time. It smacked of nepotism, even if it wasn't. And I think the clubs in particular, because they hadn't had much of a say, the way that the Congress was split was 90% state federation vote and only 10% A-League vote. And it was structured that way for a reason, so that the federation could keep a tight hold on the finances of the game, which were and still are very fragile. So it was done for a reason, but the A-League clubs had got to a point where they wanted more of a say. And I understood that, and I sort of supported them to a large degree, because a lot of the owners had put in millions of dollars. I think collectively they've lost over 400 million in the 15 years of the A-League. And they wanted a bit of a return. And more importantly, they wanted a say in how the league was run. Unfortunately, the subsequent board, under the leadership of Stephen Lowy, was very loath to give them that bigger say. And the upshot was essentially a 3-year governance war, which took the intervention of FIFA and various other bodies to ultimately resolve. And Stephen resigned his post in 2018. The Congress is now much more democratic. Unfortunately, we still haven't made much progress on the financial side of things. And that's where really the clubs, to a large degree, need to be held accountable, because they haven't delivered on what they said they were going to deliver, which is a much more profitable A-League and a better A-League. They haven't done it. So
what do you think needs to be done then? I guess is the next natural question.
Well, I still think that the governance of the game needs looking at. I think it needs a much more streamlined central body. At the moment, we have essentially 10 governing bodies in Australia, the FFA in the 9 states. I think that's 9 too many. I think we need one with maybe state advisory boards or regional bureaus with professional management to implement central policy. At the moment, they all seem to go off and do their own thing. In terms of the A-League, as I say, I think we need a proper plan to resuscitate it. We need the active fans back. We need a second division. We need promotion, relegation. We need outside investment because the game is grossly undercapitalised, which is at the root of all its problems, really. And we need a plan. We need a unified, achievable plan, the same as many other countries have done. Japan, for example, has a 100-year plan, and they're a long way down the line in that already. We seem to be reactive rather than proactive. We're constantly firefighting. We're constantly in crisis, trying to find the next dollar to, sort out that particular issue, and then we move on to the next one. It would be great to see a plan that is supported by all the stakeholders in the game to take us forward and actually fulfill the potential of this sport. Because with 2 million participants, we're by far the biggest sport in the country, but we just can't capitalise upon it and haven't been able to for 50 years.
That was going to be my next question, because you're not the first person that's told me this, that the participation levels of youth in football dominate other codes. Why isn't that translating to an audience of participation as they go through their more formative years?
Well, again, as I outlined earlier, I think there's not much of a connection between the A-League clubs and the community because they're new. A lot of people in this country, if they like football, they support a club from overseas, maybe because of their heritage or because they watch the Premier League on television. And also the other codes, as I've already said as well, they're not going to give up that ground lightly. They're the more established codes in terms of their senior competitions. They've been going for years and years and years, much longer than we have. And people have those codes and those clubs in their DNA. So that's going to take, generations really to, not that you want to shake off, their allegiance to a rugby league club or an AFL club, but to build an allegiance to an A-League club takes time. And in actual fact, we haven't done a bad job in doing that in the 15 years that the A-League has been around. It's just that the last 3 or 4 in particular, we've stalled because of the governance wars and various other things. And we need to get the focus back on the football.
I went to, a couple of years ago, I attended an event by the Cauliflower Club, which is, it's one of the monthly meetings by Rugby Union. And they were sitting down, they were talking about, why had Union fallen so far behind other areas. And they had a panel of speakers, and it was hosted by Moose, Adrian Skeggs, who was a former Wallaby. And they went through and they were talking about AFL. And apparently AFL has dedicated $1 billion of investment over 20 years into women's football. And they had done the research, and what they decided to do, and my understanding from when watching or attending this, is that this is the part of the reason for their investment in women's football is this amount of money, because through all of their research, what they had identified is that women, the wives in a marriage, are the primary decision makers of what sport children play. So they have decided that if they can get women on board to play AFL from when they're younger, realize that it's a safe sport, they'll carry that love through to those formative years of when they're raising children between the ages of 1 through 7, introducing them to sport. And I just found it absolutely fascinating, that sort of foresight of what a real plan looks like. And then of course we find out from that, free ticketing to women's AFL games, the granny leads right into the men's season. It's quite an outstanding outlook for, again, AFL may not have the global reach, but that's vision as far as I'm concerned.
Of course it is. Of course it is. And they're to be commended for that. However, what you also have to say, they have an awful lot of inherent advantages that they are using to their own greater good, which is fully within their rights to do. For a start, they have a much bigger TV deal than we do, so they can invest a lot more of that money. Secondly, they have no national teams that they have to finance. So they're not sending 9 national teams as we are all over the world to play in competition, so they can focus very much locally. Thirdly, they operate the levers of power within government and corporate Australia very, very well. They have, people positioned in areas of influence. And finally, and most importantly, they have compliant media, as does rugby league, as does cricket. We don't. We have a hostile media. We have a media here that does not want our game to succeed. We have a media here that is almost, and I'm speaking at this current moment, almost entirely bereft of football journalists. I'm talking round ball football journalists. Over the last 3 or 4 years, we have lost, in no particular order, Les Murray and Mike Cockrell, who both tragically passed away. Nothing we could do about that. Sebastian Hassett has left the football media. David Davutovic has left the Herald Sun. Matt Winley has left the Herald Sun. Daniel Garb has left Fox Sports. Carly Adno has left Fox Sports. Ray Gatt has left the Australian. Emma Kemp has left the Daily Telegraph. Craig Foster has gone off, doing his own thing, which is fair enough. Who's writing about football? Who's talking about football? Who's actually debating these issues? So the game of football in this country has been kept in its box by a media that is much more enthralled to the other sports. And when they do write about soccer, and it's always soccer in a lot of these papers, it's about hooliganism. It's about diving. It's the old Schiller's, Wogs and Pufters mentality. And that's because you have editors and executives who employ people who are like them, who like Aussie rules, rugby league, cricket. So the whole thing perpetuates itself. I've worked in the media here for 17 years. I see it every day of my working life. Now, that's not me going, oh, poor us. It's up to us to change it. We have to do something about it because nobody's going to do it for us. But we have to get real about these challenges. We have to recognize it for a start, that that's the landscape we exist in. And we have to set about formulating our plan, maybe with less dollars. Maybe it's not going to be quite as grand a scale as the AFL can do because we can't afford it. But we have to set in train a plan to take this game forward. At the moment, we're stuck in neutral. And as you know, in this country, because it's so competitive here, if you're in neutral, you're going backwards at a pretty quick rate of knots.
Fair enough. All right, a couple more questions. International football, and then we'll talk about more of a passion thing, which is
I've got about 5 minutes left. I'm going to have to go, unfortunately.
Let's talk about it now then. So what you had posted something, that's why I reached out to you about. You've got a band that you play in, and you're a fan of the new wave of British heavy metal, which is it's an era that when I was a kid, it was my growing period of the music that I would get into that would be a little bit heavier than that. But just talk about that briefly for a moment. The story is always as you get older, there's a group of closeted metalheads who never show or talk about their actual passions. It hides somewhere beneath everything else that they do. So I was very, very pleased to hear about this. Tell me how you became a fan and the bands that you're into.
Well, probably about 10 or 11 years of age, I wasn't really aware of music up until then. And a school friend of mine, I was round at his house, and he said, "Have a listen to this." And he put on the old vinyl record on his record player, and it was "Burn" by Deep Purple.
Okay.
And I remember being utterly blown away by what I'd just heard, and in particular the drumming of Ian Pace, which I just thought was phenomenal. So of course I rushed back home, and I got a couple of my mum's knitting needles and turned waste paper bins upside down and started trying to play what I'd just heard. And from that moment on, I was massively into all those rock bands and wanted to be a drummer. I got my first drum kit when I was 12 or 13, badgered the life out of my parents to buy me one. They said, no, you can't have one. It's a fad and it'll make too much noise. And eventually they relented. And I've been in bands ever since, both in the UK and here in Australia. Probably my most famous moment in music was, well, there were two actually. We played the Greenbelt Rock Festival in Northampton in the UK, which was quite big, in front of about 2,000 or 3,000 people back in the day. It was 1986, I think.
Okay.
And my band at Portsmouth, the University of Portsmouth, we supported Eric Bell and the Sunsets. Eric Bell used to be the guitarist in Thin Lizzy, so I was quite proud of that.
Okay.
And here in Australia, I'm now drumming with a metal cover band called Green Manalishi. So
A Priest band, is it?
A tribute band, like a cover band.
Yeah, to Priest.
It's called Green.
No? Green Manalishi, though? That's an old Judas Priest
Yes.
song. Oh.
Yes, it is. Yeah, good spot. Because most people say, "Oh, isn't that Fleetwood Mac?" Well, it was, but Judas Priest, did a great version of it. So, we play covers of all the bands that I grew up loving: Iron Maiden, Judas Priest, Motorhead, Black Sabbath, the odd Sex Pistols one here and there. But I loved all those bands.
Being English as well, were you a Saxon fan?
Yes, Saxon were the first metal band I ever saw live, which was at the Manchester Apollo in 1984, and they were supported by Girls' School. I don't know if you remember Girls' School.
Yeah, Girls' School was out here last year. They did an old retro '80s tour because I remember Girls' School. They also used to. There's like 3 or 4 Motorhead songs that they guest starred on because I'm a big Lemmy guy. That's Sabbath, Lemmy, Priest are probably my new wave of British heavy metal bands. Those are I even like the Tim Ripper Owens Judas Priest stuff. I'm big on that stuff as well. I love it all. But Motorhead was the big We Are the Road Crew, and I had all those because even at the time when I was a kid, Motorhead still probably would have been on their like 19th greatest hits or collection. You know, you got Overkill. And then I think I got like Live at the Hammersmith or something along those lines. And,
No Sleep Till Hammersmith.
Yeah. So did you advance? Did you get any heavier, I guess is the next question.
Did I get any heavier? No, I'm sort of a man stuck in my time, really. Look, I like a bit of the new stuff. I like a bit of Slipknot. Not that it's new these days, but a bit of Linkin Park, Il Nino from a few years ago, but I tend to sort of stick with what I know and like. I'm in a bit of a time warp, unfortunately.
Oh, you always are.
I did go and see Maiden and Sabbath when they came out on tour here a few years ago, so enjoyed watching them both and their new albums.
Have you listened to Sabaton?
No, I don't think so.
I think you're going to love these guys. All they do is epic heavy metal about war. That's it. It's fantastic. I think you're really going to enjoy it. But look, as you said, you got to get going. I certainly don't want to take up any more of your time. But when this whole thing comes back together, once you roll into town, I'd love to buy you a beer and just chat shop.
That'd be good, mate. Look forward to it. We can talk metal.
Absolutely. Well, I appreciate your time, Simon Hill. I've already had my beers. You're well off to get into them now. So thank you very much for your time tonight.
Thanks, Jesse.